Yeah, I mean, your surprise, or whether it's you're making a point of it, but that is almost the question I always ask: what's not to like? You've got these schools which are ubiquitous, serving a majority of poor kids in the urban areas and a significant minority of rural kids. You've got these schools where the children do better after controlling for the background variables that are they're affordable to poor families, that are fair to girls. I haven't mentioned that, but that's also a finding of research. They tend not to discriminate in general against girls, and that are sustainable because they're run as small businesses and already at scale, so scalable. What's not to like? And so then you have to say, well, the opposition comes from governments, yes, and not all governments, incidentally. Some state governments I've worked with, particularly in Nigeria, and actually the national government in Ghana, actually see this as helping them out. They recognize that if all the kids in the private schools came into the government sector would be completely overwhelmed. It just couldn't cope, and therefore, actually realize that these schools are probably a good thing. That does happen sometimes, but typically it doesn't happen. And it's the international agencies, the NGOs, the international teacher unions, which fits in with your quote you've mentioned just now. They're all against these schools. And why are they against these schools? Well, I guess, if you're in favor of, if you believe the government should do education and you're in favor of government education, then it's a bit of an insult, isn't it? Your poor parents are saying, I don't want your government schools. In the government schools, our children are abandoned. If I've got the choice, if I've got any money at all, I'll send my child to the private schools, a private school. And that must be quite insulting and hurtful to someone who's been working in favor of government education. And so they look for problems with that. And of course, one problem is these schools charge fees. And therefore, well, first of all, you can paint them with a sort of a capitalist brush. You can say, well, they're just exploiting teachers, exploiting parents, and so on. If you've got an anti-capitalist mentality, you can do that, I guess. That doesn't really wash, for the reasons we've already discussed. These schools are better. The teachers work hard, but are not exploited because these are market rates. So that doesn't really wash, but anyway, people will still use it. But they'll also say, and this is, I've heard many times, and I wrote about it in one of my books, The Beautiful Tree, the private schools cannot possibly be pro-poor, because if you charge fees, you're not, you're against the poor, aren't you? And government schools don't charge fees. And obviously there's something in this. I would like, my work has been about creating opportunities for as many children as possible, my life's work. And obviously there are some who are excluded because they are too poor to afford private schools. But two things about that. One is those families are typically also too poor to afford government schools, because although government schools don't charge fees in the same way, often they will have levies, a building levy, a development levy, or something like that. But in any case, the other costs of going to schools are still there. So you've still got to buy shoes, still got to buy uniform. And typically the government schools are less flexible. If you haven't got shoes or your proper uniform, you'll be excluded, where private schools probably, because they understand the community they're from, will make some sort of tolerance there, but the government schools often won't. So you need shoes, you need uniform, you need books. Typically the government schools are further away from the community. The private schools are right in the community. The government schools are maybe some distance away. So you need transport costs to go to the government schools in a way you don't need for the private schools. So we've done research on this, and a typical figure is the cost to a parent of sending a child to a government school is 75% of the cost of sending to a low-cost private school. That's a figure I've had from Nigeria and Liberia.
That's incredible.
Yeah, because of all these other costs. The fees are just, well, they're significant. This is still more expensive, but it's not it's not the deciding factor. So but back to my 2 points. The first one is, yes, there are some people who are too poor to go to the private schools. They're typically too poor to go to the government schools too. And therefore I want to help them. And so how do we help them? Well, maybe it's through a voucher system, or maybe it's through, philanthropy, or it's even looking at ways of reducing the cost even further to make it more and more accessible to more and more children, perhaps through, as technology improves, broadband, Wi-Fi improves and so on, through technology. So that's the first point. And the second point is, well, no, I think that's the first and the same works together. So they are too poor for some, but we can find other ways of making them more accessible. Yeah. And of course, I always say to the critics of these sectors, well, I want to be with you when you look a poor parent in the eye, this mother who's scrimped and saved to send a child to the private school. I want you to look her in the eye and say, actually, no, that school is not pro-poor. You've got to go to the government school and get your child's education there. Why would you? How would you have the audacity to come into a place when the poor parent, money is precious, and they have made that decision, quite rational decision, as the research shows, quite rational decision, to take the child out of the government schools? How would you dare?
But isn't that the problem, that many of these individuals don't have that perspective? They don't have that on the ground perspective, that they really know what's going on.
Yeah, I think there is something in that. I mean, I don't want to be too critical of this, but there is a sense that some development experts fly into the country, go from the airport to a posh part of town to a posh hotel, and then often will be taken by the government department to go and see some of poor areas, but they're always under tutelage, under the protection, and they never sort of wander themselves. This is the one thing I did well. I mean, I did this well. I just decided to go into these areas on my own, the poorest slums on the planet, and just see what I found. And I think that is very unusual for a researcher. That's very unusual for someone in development. It's also unusual for government. And the one incident happened in Lagos, which happened a few times. So in Lagos, I was giving a talk at a conference in one of these posh hotels on Victoria Island. For those who know Lagos, that's the posh area. And I think I was giving a talk towards the end of the conference. And one of the senior government officials approached me, I think, as the conference was ending, and said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Oh, well, I'm going back to Makoko." It's one of these poor shanty towns in Lagos. I was doing some teacher training or some curriculum work, I can't remember. And he said, "Oh, that's fine." Anyway, I went to there, and as I was coming into the area, because not many cars come in that area, I realized I was being followed. And eventually we stopped, to go to the path to one of these schools. And it was definitely clear I was being followed. And out stepped the woman from the high-ranking government official. Out she stepped, and she said, "I've never been here. I've never seen these schools. I just wanted, I wanted to see if you were genuine, Tooley, if you were really working in these areas, and B, I wanted to see for myself." And it was extraordinary. And she, her eyes were open. She'd never seen this sort of thing going on. And presumably she was sort of converted afterwards to realize that these schools were doing something very special, which she and so many others like her just had not seen for themselves.